St. Thomas Aquinas was born around 1225 AD to one of the most powerful families in Italy. And although all of his brothers went into the military, his family decided that he would join his uncle in a Benedictine monastery. Conflict broke out soon between the Pope and Emperor Frederick II, and so Aquinas' parents took him from the monastery and enrolled him in a university. When he turned 19, he decided that he wanted to join the Dominican order. His parents objected strongly to that decision, and his brothers kidnapped him, held him hostage, and even hired a prostitute to attempt to literally seduce him away from his aspirations. Luckily for us, their attempts to dissuade him failed, and he moved to Paris to study and eventually teach theology. Although he is known today as one of the greatest theologians and philosophers who have ever lived, and although he became a saint in the Catholic Church in the year 1323, his life was not without controversy, and some of his views were actually formally condemned in 1377 by a Parisian bishop. Aquinas' most famous work is the Sumo Theologica, which was written from 1265 to 1274. And in the first part of this module, in this video that I'm making right now, we're going to be taking a look at his 5 ways of proving that God exists. So his first way of proving that God exists has to do with change. Consider the strings on my mandolin. So right now, the strings are not vibrating. They're quite still, but they could move. And in particular, if I move my pick across them, they're going to move. Aquinas would describe all this as follows. The strings right now are not actually moving, but they have a potentiality for being moving strings. When I move my hand across the strings, what I'm doing is drawing the potentiality into actuality. I'm transforming the string from something that is potentially moving into something that is actually moving. Now notice 2 things. First, a moving string is potentially a still string, and a still string is potentially a moving string. But a moving string is not potentially a moving string, it is actually a moving string, and a still string is not potentially a still string, it is actually a still string. Second, my hand had to move in order to transform the potentially moving string into an actually moving string. A still mandolin string cannot transform itself from potentiality into actuality. And this is because only something that is actually moving can cause something else to transition from potentially moving to actually moving. So I got to move my hand to make the string move. It doesn't do it itself. My moving hand caused the mandolin string to change from a potentially moving object into an actually moving object. But a complicated series of nerve and muscle movements caused my hand to change from a potentially moving to an actually moving hand, and so on. We can trace this causal chain all day, but according to Aquinas, it cannot be infinite. There must have been some first cause of change, some first mover that did the first moving from potentiality to actuality. And that first mover, the first cause of the change from potentiality to actuality, is God. So here's a formal presentation of that argument. And I want you to look at this so you can see all the steps laid out neatly. Premise 1, all bodies are either potentially in motion or actually in motion. Premise 2, but nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Premise 3, nothing can be at once in both actuality and potentiality in the same respect. 4, first conclusion. Therefore, nothing can be at once in both actuality and potentiality with respect to motion. Next conclusion. Therefore, nothing can move itself. It must be put into motion by something else. Next premise. If there were no first mover moved by no other, there would be no motion. 7, but there is motion. And finally, our conclusion, therefore, there is a first mover, which is God. So that's the first way of proving that God exists. The second way is very similar to the first. Instead of talking about causes of change, of the transformation of potentiality into actuality, in the second proof, Aquinas is talking about something called an efficient cause. An efficient cause of something is the source of a change in something else. So imagine that a pitcher throws a baseball, and I swing my bat and hit it, and the ball shoots off into the distance. Me swinging the bat is the efficient cause of the ball flying away. Now, nothing can be its own efficient cause, and the reason for this is that efficient causes have to come before their effects. And since something can't exist prior to itself, nothing can be its own efficient cause. Now imagine the chain of efficient causes that led to my hitting the baseball in this story. If we were to remove one of the causes, let's say remove the pitcher throwing the ball, what's going to happen? Well, none of the subsequent effects in the chain would ever happen. There must, then, have been a first cause that started the chain of efficient causes that led to all of the causes and effects that we observe today. And this first efficient cause is God. So again, let's formalize it. Premise 1, nothing is the efficient cause of itself. Premise 2, if A is the efficient cause of B, then if A is absent, so is B. Premise 3, efficient causes are ordered from first cause through intermediate causes to ultimate effects. First conclusion, by 2 and 3, if there is no first cause, there cannot be any ultimate effect. Next premise, but there are effects. And then our conclusion, therefore, there must be a first cause for all of them, which is God. Let's go on to the third way of proving that God exists. This way of proving that God exists has to do with possibility and necessity. So consider a mandolin. It was made sometime around 2014, and before that it didn't exist. At some point it'll be destroyed and it will no longer exist. According to Aquinas, many things are like my mandolin. They can either exist or fail to exist. And there were times in the past, and there will be times in the future, when they do not exist. I'm going to refer to objects like that as objects that exist possibly. So let's suppose that everything is like my mandolin in the sense that it exists possibly. If everything exists possibly, then there must have been a time when nothing existed. That's impossible. Why? Well, it's impossible because let's think about it. Like, how did my mandolin come into existence? Well, some luthier who worked for Fender made it. And how did the luthier come into existence? Well, the luthier's parents made them, and so on. My mandolin, like everything else, can only be brought into existence by something that already exists. And for this reason, there couldn't have been a time when nothing existed. If there had been a time when nothing existed, then there wouldn't have existed anything that could have brought anything else into existence. And if that were true, then there wouldn't be anything in existence now. But there are things, such as my mandolin, that are in existence now. Since there couldn't have been a time when nothing existed, there must be something that exists by necessity rather than merely existing possibly. And I'm going to say that something exists by necessity. If it exists by necessity, that there's no time when it doesn't exist. And this thing which exists by necessity is God. So again, let's formalize the argument. First premise, we find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be. These are contingent beings, or beings that exist possibly. Premise 2, everything is either necessary or contingent. Premise 3, let's assume that everything is contingent. And then premise 4, it is impossible for contingent beings always to exist, for that which cannot be at some time is not. And our first conclusion, therefore, by 3 and 4, at one time there was nothing. And then number 6, that which does not exist begins to exist only through something already existing. And then our next conclusion, therefore, by 5 and 6, there's nothing now. Premise 8, but there is something now. Next conclusion, therefore, 3 is false. And our final conclusion, therefore, by 2, there is a necessary being, which is God. Fourth way of proving that God exists is much less complicated than the first 3, and it has to do with gradations. So when I grade you on your writing, I will assign you a grade out of 100. 100 represents the maximum quality that a paper can have, and any grade less than that is a reflection of how far your work has departed from that maximum. The point generalizes. For any quality, we can say that something has more or less of that quality based on how far away it is from the maximum. To use another example, we can say how cold something is based on how far away it is from absolute zero. Some things are better, truer, and more noble than other things. And since some things have these qualities of goodness, truth, and nobility, there must be something else that is maximally good, maximally true, and maximally noble. So after making these points, Aquinas is then going to borrow two assertions from Aristotle. So first, those things that are greatest in truth and greatest in being, are greatest in being. And then second, the greatest of a kind is the cause of everything of that kind. So here's how Aristotle explains it in Book 2, 993b in the Metaphysics. So I'm going to recite a quote for you. Now everything through which a common quality is communicated to other things is itself of all those things in the highest degree possessed of that quality. Example, fire is hottest because it is the cause of heat in everything else. Hence, that also is most true, which causes all subsequent things to be true. So what we're looking for is a being that is the noblest, truest, best being, and which is the cause of all nobility, truth, and goodness, and that being is God. And here's the formal expression of the argument. Premise 1. There is a gradation to be found in things. Some are better, hotter, colder, etc. than others. Premise 2. Things are X in proportion to how closely they resemble that which is most X. First conclusion. Therefore, if there is nothing which is most X, there can be nothing which is good. Next conclusion. It follows that if anything is good, there must be something that is most good. And our next conclusion, therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. Now, for the final way of proving that God exists, when I play the mandolin, I am acting for a reason. I'm a conscious being with a goal in my head, and I'm seeking to accomplish that goal through my mandolin. Now, objects that aren't conscious also act for a purpose. When I drop a mandolin pick, which I just did a minute ago, so I can't find it, pretend this is a mandolin pick, it's going to fall and it'll come to rest on the ground. And it will do the same thing if I do it again. Now, there must be something in nature, that is, directing unintelligent objects that have no consciousness too. And that being is God. So here's a formal presentation of the argument again. Number 1, premise 1, we observe that natural bodies act towards ends. Premise 2, anything that acts towards an end either acts out of knowledge, like I do, or under the direction of something with knowledge. So, for example, as the arrow is directed by the archer. Premise 3, but many natural beings lack knowledge. And then our conclusion, therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. All right, so those were Aquinas' 5 ways of proving that God exists. That was kind of a whirlwind. You should definitely go back and review them. I'm sure you didn't get them all the first time. What I'm going to do now is make 3 general points about how to object and how not to object to his proofs. So the first thing I'll say is that although this may seem tempting, it is inappropriate to respond to him as follows. Well, everyone has a different definition of God, so Aquinas hasn't given a proof of God. Now, it's correct to note that Aquinas hasn't given a proof of Thor, of the flying spaghetti monster, Krishna, or the Virgin Mary. But here's what he has done. He's given proofs of the following claims: that there's a being that exists by necessity, that is the first cause of change, that is the first efficient cause, that is the noblest, truest, and best being, and it's the cause of nobility, truth, and goodness, and which directs all unintelligent physical objects. If his proofs are sound, then a being with all those properties exists. And what would we call such a being other than God? Now, here's the thing. It's a separate question whether any of the major religions are correct in the additional things that they say about God. So perhaps the Christians are wrong that God has the property of sending his son to die for our sins. Perhaps the Jews are wrong that God made a covenant with Abraham. And perhaps the Muslims are wrong that Muhammad was a prophet. All of that's beside the point. The question you need to ask when you're evaluating Aquinas' arguments are, did Aquinas succeed in proving that a being with all of those properties that I listed at the end of his arguments exists? And if so, is God the right word to refer to that being? All right, so the second thing to say is that if you want to object to one of Aquinas' arguments, it's not enough to just make a broad critique of what he said. It's not enough, for example, to just say, well, evolution happened. And this is because we should not, I'm not saying we should doubt that evolution happened. It definitely did happen. What I'm saying is that I want you to be more specific when specifying how you are critiquing Aquinas' arguments. What I want you to do is to go back to his argument and identify which statement in particular from his argument you are saying is false. So I'll give you an example. For example, let's go back to the fourth proof. So the fourth proof depends on the assumption that things are x in proportion to how closely they resemble that which is most x. And one way of arguing against the fourth proof is to argue that this assumption is false. So when you take on this more demanding task of specifying which premise exactly is false, you're going to see that criticizing Aquinas' arguments is much more challenging than it may at first seem. But this class would be a waste of your time if I didn't demand that you do philosophy the right way rather than the easy way. All right, so the final thing I want to say is that you need to be really careful when drawing conclusions from developments in scientific knowledge. So a couple of years ago, there was a physicist named Lawrence Krauss, and he attempted to argue that developments in physics have taught us that something can, in fact, come from nothing. Now, a rough sketch of his argument is that relativistic quantum field theory explains how a universe that contains no particles can turn into a universe that does contain particles. But as philosopher David Albert pointed out in a scathing review in the New York Times, Krauss has not shown how something can come from nothing. Instead, all he's shown is that a universe that contains relativistic quantum field vacuum states that don't correspond to the existence of particles can, due to the laws of quantum mechanics and general relativity, transition into a different vacuum state that corresponds to the existence of particles. But relativistic quantum field vacuum states aren't nothing. They're something. And what about the laws of physics? Are those nothing? So Krauss hasn't shown that something has come from nothing. I'm going to quote Albert directly because what he said was just so spicy, I want you to enjoy it. So he says, relativistic quantum field theoretical vacuum states, no less than giraffes or refrigerators or solar systems, are particular arrangements of elementary physical stuff. The true relativistic quantum field theoretical equivalent to there not being any physical stuff at all isn't this or that particular arrangement of the fields. What it is, obviously and ineluctably, and on the contrary, the simple absence of the fields. The fact that some arrangements of fields happen to correspond to the existence of particles and some don't is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that some of the possible arrangements of my fingers happen to correspond to the existence of a fist and some don't. And the fact that particles can pop in and out of existence over time as those fields rearrange themselves is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that fists can pop in and out of existence over time as my fingers rearrange themselves. And none of these poppings, if you look at them all right, amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing. So Albert's response is decisive. So here's my lesson. My third recommendation to you is to think very carefully when trying to draw inferences from developments in modern science. It is possible that some of Aquinas' proofs depend on empirical claims that are inconsistent with today's best scientific theories. But it's also possible that in many cases, our best theories merely enrich Aquinas' arguments by explaining the physical details behind the claims that he's making.